Airline crew throws black woman's luggage. 9 minutes later discover she's the new owner. They thought she was just another passenger, a nobody they could mock and dismiss. From the gate to the cabin, their whispers grew louder, their actions bolder, each one more disrespectful than the last. But none of them knew the truth. None of them realized that the woman they were humiliating wasn't just flying first class. She was about to redefine the entire airline. And in exactly 9 minutes, their world would come crashing down. The airport buzzed with its usual chaos, a symphony of hurried footsteps, intercom announcements, and muffled conversations. Among the throng of travelers, Kiana James walked with a quiet elegance, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. Her sharp black blazer and silk scarf spoke of sophistication, but her serene expression carried an air of humility. Her hands gripped the leather handle of her suitcase, the faintest tremor betraying her composure. As she approached the check-in counter, she noticed the shift in demeanor from the airline staff. Their smiles, plastered on for the previous customers, faded the moment their eyes landed on her. The young woman at the desk with a name tag reading Maddie straightened her posture but couldn't hide the flicker of disdain in her eyes. "Good morning," Kiana said, her voice smooth yet firm. She slid her first-class ticket across the counter with practiced grace. Maddie took the ticket, hesitating just long enough to make it noticeable. Her gaze scanned the ticket and then lingered on Kiana's face, as if trying to reconcile the two. Maddie murmured under her breath, her lips curling into a forced smile. "Flying first class today, I see." "Yes," Kiana replied, maintaining her calm. She was no stranger to this kind of subtle condescension. It clung to her like an unwelcome shadow in spaces where she wasn't expected to belong. Maddie turned to her colleague, a tall man with a buzz cut named Bryce. "Hey," she said with a smirk, loud enough for Kiana to hear. "Can you check this? Just making sure everything's legit." Bryce chuckled, taking the ticket and holding it up to the light as if it were counterfeit money. Kiana stood silently, her gaze steady but unyielding. The people behind her in line began to murmur, the weight of their stares pressing against her back. "It's fine," Bryce finally said, handing the ticket back with an exaggerated shrug. "Guess she's good to go." "Thank you," Kiana said, taking the ticket without looking at him. She stepped aside, her fingers tightening on the handle of her suitcase. As she moved to the luggage drop-off area, she glanced back. Maddie and Bryce were leaning toward each other, laughing, their eyes darting in her direction. Kiana's chest tightened, but she kept walking, each step deliberate and controlled. At the conveyor belt, another staff member grabbed her suitcase. He was an older man, his uniform slightly disheveled. Without a word, he tossed her luggage onto the belt, the force causing it to teeter before slamming onto its side. One of the smaller bags toppled to the floor, the contents threatening to spill out. "Excuse me," Kiana said, stepping forward. "Could you please handle that with more care?" The man barely glanced at her. "It's just luggage," he muttered, scooping the bag up with a single hand and flinging it onto the belt. "It'll get where it needs to go." Kiana inhaled deeply. The words she wanted to say caught in her throat. She knew this battle all too well, the exhausting effort of demanding basic respect. Instead, she straightened her shoulders. "Thank you," she said, her tone clipped. As she turned toward the boarding gate, she heard a faint snicker from behind. Her heart pounded in her chest, a mix of anger and frustration surging through her veins. But her steps never faltered. She walked with the same grace she had arrived with, knowing that every second she held her composure was a victory they couldn't take from her. The tension simmered beneath the surface as Kiana approached the gate. The interactions might have seemed inconsequential to an onlooker. An odd glance here, a careless word there, but she knew better. She had spent her life navigating these moments, each one a reminder that in their eyes she was always being judged. Today, however, would be different. Today, she wasn't just another passenger they could dismiss. Kiana's fingers grazed the phone in her pocket. The temptation to make a call lingered, but she resisted. Instead, she allowed herself a small, knowing smile. Justice was patient, and so was she. Kiana stood at the boarding gate, her calm mask still intact, though cracks began to form beneath the surface. The gate agent, Phil, was scanning tickets in a robotic rhythm, his sharp eyes flicking toward each passenger with a practiced efficiency. But when Kiana stepped forward, presenting her first-class ticket with a polite nod, Phil hesitated, his brow furrowed as though he were examining something suspicious. Phil muttered, his voice low but pointed. He tilted the ticket to one side, his lips tightening. "Is there an issue?" Kiana asked, her tone neutral but firm. Phil looked up, his expression an unsettling mix of condescension and false professionalism. "Oh, nothing serious," he said, his voice dripping with insincerity. "It's just that we've had incidents with misplaced tickets before, you understand, right? Can't be too careful." Kiana raised an eyebrow but said nothing. She knew where this was headed. It wasn't the first time her competence, her worth, her very presence had been called into question in these ways. Subtle, insidious, yet piercing. Phil scanned the ticket with exaggerated slowness, his fingers hovering over the machine as though the process required great deliberation. When the scanner beeped green, Phil's demeanor didn't shift. Instead, he leaned slightly closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "First class, huh? Must have been a special occasion." Kiana met Phil's gaze with unflinching composure. "Every occasion is special," she replied evenly. Phil's lips twitched, and he leaned back with a dismissive shrug. "Sure thing," he said, waving Kiana through. "Enjoy your flight." As Kiana moved past the gate, her ears caught snippets of murmured words behind her. Phil had leaned over to his colleague, Tony, whispering in a tone that wasn't as quiet as she thought. "Bet she won some sweepstakes or something," Phil said, his laughter barely stifled. "No way she paid for that herself." Tony chuckled. "Either that, or she's just really good at sugar daddy hunting." The word stung, sharper than Kiana had expected. She paused for the briefest moment, her breath catching in her throat, but she didn't turn around. Dignity was her shield, and she clung to it like armor. Stepping onto the aircraft, Kiana felt the tension in the air immediately. The flight attendants, clad in pristine uniforms, seemed to scan each passenger with an almost clinical detachment. When their eyes fell on Kiana, however, something changed. Their smiles, bright and welcoming for others, dimmed into thin, strained lines. One attendant, Claire, approached her with a clipboard in hand. "Ma'am, may I see your ticket again?" she asked, her voice clipped and impatient. Kiana frowned but complied, handing over the ticket she had already presented at the gate. Claire inspected it as though it might suddenly reveal hidden flaws. "You're in seat 2A, correct?" she asked, though the information was plainly written on the ticket in bold letters. "Yes," Kiana replied, her tone sharp enough to slice through the facade of doubt. Claire nodded but didn't step aside. "Just making sure everything's in order. We've had, issues in the past with misplaced seating." "Everything seems to be in order," Kiana said pointedly, her patience thinning. Claire pursed her lips and finally stepped aside. Kiana moved to her seat, settling into the plush leather and placing her handbag neatly by her feet. Yet the sense of unease followed her, clinging like an unwelcome guest. As the plane began to fill, Kiana glanced out the window, hoping to distract herself from the tension. Her gaze drifted to the luggage handlers outside. Her stomach dropped when she saw her suitcase, the distinctive black and gold trim unmistakable, being tossed carelessly onto the luggage cart. One of the handlers, a burly man with a bored expression, hoisted the suitcase above his head and then let it fall with a loud thud. The force of the drop caused the bag to burst open slightly, the contents barely held in place by the zipper. Kiana inhaled sharply, her hands gripping the armrests. She pressed the call button above her seat, her calm demeanor beginning to fray. A different flight attendant, Rick, approached, his expression already lined with annoyance. "Yes, ma'am," he said, his tone implying anything but genuine concern. Kiana pointed toward the window. "That's my luggage," she said, her voice steady but tinged with anger. They just dropped it and the bag appears damaged. Rick leaned over to look, squinting as though the scene required great effort to decipher. It's just a suitcase, he said with a dismissive wave of his hand. They'll sort it out. It's not just a suitcase, Kiana countered, her voice firm. It's my property, and it deserves to be treated with care. Rick sighed audibly, his shoulders slumping as though her words were a great inconvenience. I'll make a note, he said, turning away without further acknowledgement. Kiana didn't respond to Rick's dismissive wave. Instead, she rose from her seat, her expression calm but unyielding. If this is how you handle customer concerns, I'd like to speak to your supervisor immediately. Passengers nearby began to notice, some craning their necks to catch a better view. A woman seated a row ahead leaned toward her companion and whispered, "She looks serious." Rick smirked, the disdain unmistakable. "Ma'am, we're preparing for takeoff. This isn't the time to cause a scene." His eyes flicked to Claire, but she averted her gaze, clearly reluctant to intervene. A scene? Kiana's eyebrow arched, her tone icy. If treating customer property with care is too much to ask, maybe this airline should reevaluate how it trains its staff. A man in a tailored suit seated near the window spoke up. "She's got a point. I had my luggage mishandled on this airline just last week. Nobody cared then either." Another passenger chimed in. "Yeah, if she hadn't said something, we wouldn't even know this kind of thing was happening." Rick's expression darkened as murmurs of agreement rippled through the cabin. He opened his mouth, but Kiana cut him off, her voice steady and firm. "You're here to serve customers, and I am one of them. I demand to be treated with respect just like everyone else on this flight." The murmurs grew louder. Several passengers began taking out their phones, pointing their cameras toward the unfolding scene. Kiana noticed but didn't flinch, fully aware of the momentum building in her favor. Finally, Claire stepped in, her tone soft but tinged with worry. "Rick, let me handle this." Rick hesitated before taking a step back, his glare sharp as he eyed Kiana. Claire knelt slightly to meet Kiana's gaze. "I sincerely apologize, ma'am. We'll make a note of this incident and ensure it's addressed after landing." Kiana returned to her seat, her posture still commanding, though she said nothing further. She knew the issue was far from resolved. They would face her again soon enough. They just didn't know it yet. As the flight attendants prepared for takeoff, Kiana overheard Claire and Rick whispering nearby. "She's probably gonna write a complaint," Claire said, rolling her eyes. "Some people just can't handle a little wear and tear." Rick chuckled. "Maybe she should have stuck to coach if she's so worried about her precious luggage." The words were spoken just loud enough for Kiana to hear. She closed her eyes, her chest rising and falling as she struggled to contain the storm brewing within her. She had endured these microaggressions her entire life, but this was something different. It wasn't just the careless treatment of her belongings or the disrespectful whispers. It was the unrelenting assumption that she didn't belong. And yet, despite it all, she remained composed. For now. Kiana opened her eyes, her fingers brushing against the phone in her pocket. The moment wasn't right, not yet, but justice was patient. And so was she. The hum of the engines filled the cabin as the plane leveled off at cruising altitude. Outside the window, clouds stretched endlessly, their edges tinged with golden sunlight. Inside, the air was thick with an undercurrent of tension, at least for Kiana. She leaned back in her seat, her fingers grazing the armrest as her thoughts churned. The indignities of the day replayed in her mind, the mocking stares, the sarcastic comments, the careless treatment of her belongings. It wasn't the first time she had encountered such behavior, but the weight of it never diminished. Each moment felt like a cut, small but deliberate, leaving scars that no amount of success could entirely erase. The flight attendants moved through the cabin, their smiles bright but mechanical. Kiana noticed how they engaged warmly with other passengers, laughing at their jokes and bending over slightly as if to offer more attentive service. When they passed by her, however, their smiles faltered, their movements brisk, their words clipped. "Would you like a snack?" One of them, a younger man with perfectly combed hair, asked her with a tone that barely concealed indifference. Kiana glanced up from her book. "No, thank you," she replied, her voice calm but firm. He nodded, not meeting her eyes, and moved on without another word. Kiana returned to her book, but the words blurred before her eyes. Her mind refused to let go of the scene she had witnessed earlier, her luggage being thrown carelessly, the crew laughing as if it were a game. She could almost hear their chuckles, the sound of her suitcase hitting the ground. The thought made her grip the edge of the hardcover tighter, her knuckles whitening. She closed the book and set it down, her eyes drifting toward the window. The world below was distant and unrecognizable, a patchwork of fields and rivers that seemed impossibly small from this height. She had worked tirelessly to rise above the limitations others tried to impose on her, to carve out a place for herself where she couldn't be easily dismissed. Yet, even at this altitude, she felt the familiar weight of prejudice pulling her down. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing the estimated time of arrival. The attendant from earlier, the one who had served her water without a word, appeared again, this time collecting meal trays from the other passengers. She avoided Kiana's row entirely. A man across the aisle, who had been watching Kiana intermittently since boarding, leaned slightly in her direction. He was middle-aged, with salt and pepper hair and an expensive watch that caught the light whenever he moved his hand. "Excuse me," he said, his voice low but audible. "Are you traveling for business or—" Kiana turned to him slowly, her expression neutral. She recognized the undertone in his question, the unspoken doubt, the curiosity about her presence in first class. She had encountered it countless times before, in boardrooms and conferences, in elevators and lounges. "Business," she said simply, her tone giving nothing away. The man nodded, his gaze lingering a moment longer before he leaned back in his seat. Kiana could feel his unasked questions hanging in the air. She ignored him, turning her attention to her phone as she unlocked the screen and scrolled through her emails. Among the unread messages was one marked urgent from her legal team. She tapped it open, her lips curving into a faint smile as she read the subject line. "Acquisition completed, all systems go." The satisfaction was brief, like a single breath of fresh air in a stifling room. She placed the phone back in her lap and closed her eyes, letting her thoughts wander to the days ahead. There would be meetings, press releases, a whirlwind of activity as the world learned of the shift in power. But for now, she was still in this cabin, in this moment, surrounded by people who saw her as less than she was. The most blatant act of disrespect came later, as Kiana stood to retrieve something from her overhead compartment. She had placed a small bag there, a leather case containing essential items she preferred to keep close. As she reached up to open the compartment, she heard Rick's voice behind her. "Ma'am, you can't block the aisle," Rick said sharply. Kiana turned, her expression neutral. "I'm just retrieving my bag. I won't take long." Rick folded her arms, her expression impatient. "If it's not urgent, I'd appreciate it if you waited until after service." The tone was unmistakable, dismissive, authoritative, and meant to put Kiana in her place. Kiana hesitated for a moment, her hand still on the compartment handle before stepping aside. "Of course," she said softly, her calm tone masking the irritation boiling inside her. She returned to her seat, watching as Rick walked away, her posture stiff with self-satisfaction. The culmination of the tension came just before landing. As the attendants prepared the cabin for descent, Rick approached Kiana's seat again, this time holding a passenger feedback card. "We like to get feedback from our first-class passengers," he said, his tone neutral but his expression cold. He handed her the card, then immediately turned to the passenger across the aisle, his demeanor softening. "I hope you enjoyed your flight with us, sir." Kiana stared at the card in her hand, the irony of the gesture not lost on her. They wanted her feedback, yet they hadn't extended her the same courtesy or respect they had shown others. She set the card down on her tray table, the edges crinkling slightly under her fingertips. The attendant returned, clearing away empty glasses. When she reached Kiana's row, she hesitated, her hand hovering over the water glass. Kiana looked up, her gaze steady, and the attendant quickly picked up the glass, muttering a barely audible, "Thank you," before moving on. Kiana watched her retreat down the aisle, the faintest flicker of pity stirring in her chest. She knew the attendant's behavior wasn't born entirely of malice. It was ignorance, fueled by a lifetime of assumptions and biases. But that didn't excuse it. Not today. She glanced at her phone again. 9 minutes. That's all it would take. As the plane began its descent, the cabin buzzed with the sounds of passengers preparing for landing. Bags were zipped, seat belts clicked into place, and murmured conversations filled the air. Kiana remained still, her hands resting lightly on her lap. Her gaze was fixed on the horizon outside the window, where the cityscape was coming into view. The attendant reappeared, this time with a strained smile that didn't reach her eyes. "We'll be landing shortly. Please ensure your seatbelt is fastened." Kiana nodded but said nothing. The attendant lingered for a moment as if expecting a response, before moving on. The wheels touched down with a slight jolt and the cabin erupted into applause, a tradition Kiana had always found amusing but endearing. She unbuckled her seatbelt, her movements unhurried as she prepared to disembark. The weight of what was about to unfold pressed against her, but it wasn't a burden, it was a promise. The plane taxied to the gate, and the captain announced the usual pleasantries. As passengers stood to retrieve their belongings, Kiana remained seated, watching the flow of people with a quiet intensity. She could feel the subtle shifts in the atmosphere, the unspoken hierarchies playing out as some passengers jostled for position while others waited patiently. When it was her turn, she stood gracefully, retrieving her bag from the overhead compartment. As she stepped into the aisle, she noticed the same attendant watching her from the galley. Their eyes met, and for a brief moment, there was something almost like fear in the attendant's gaze. Kiana held the gaze, her expression calm but unyielding, before turning away. As she stepped off the plane and into the terminal, her phone buzzed in her hand. She glanced at the screen, reading the message from her assistant. "They're ready." Kiana's lips curved into a faint smile. Now, she thought, it begins. The jet bridge was cold and sterile, its metal walls amplifying the echo of hurried footsteps. Kiana walked with deliberate poise, her heels clicking softly on the floor. Her expression remained calm, almost serene, but inside she felt the weight of anticipation pressing down on her chest. The message on her phone played on a loop in her mind. "They're ready." As she emerged into the terminal, the usual chaos greeted her, passengers scurrying to their gates, families reuniting with hugs and laughter, the mechanical voice of the intercom announcing departures and arrivals. But Kiana saw none of it. Her focus was sharp, her path clear. Ahead, near the baggage claim area, a small group of airline executives stood waiting. Their crisp suits and polished shoes marked them as people accustomed to authority. The man in the center, tall with graying hair and a commanding presence, was unmistakably Michael Hayes, the airline's CEO. Kiana's eyes narrowed slightly as she observed the group from a distance. They hadn't noticed her yet, their attention focused on something or someone off to the side. The baggage claim area buzzed with activity. Conveyor belts groaned as they carried suitcases in an endless loop. Kiana approached slowly, her gaze scanning the area until she spotted them. Maddie, Bryce, and the older crew member from earlier. The ones who had dismissed her and treated her belongings with such careless disdain. They were standing near the conveyor belt, their postures stiff, their expressions unreadable. For a moment, Kiana paused, watching them from afar. She wondered if they had any inkling of what was about to unfold. Did they feel the creeping unease of their actions catching up to them? Or were they oblivious, still smug in their assumptions about her? Her phone buzzed again. This time, the message was simple. "It's time." Kiana inhaled deeply, smoothing the front of her blazer. Her heels clicked against the polished floor as she resumed her stride, each step measured and deliberate. Heads turned as she passed, drawn by the quiet authority in her demeanor. Even the executives noticed her approach. their conversation faltering as Michael Hayes turned toward her. "Miss James," he said, his voice warm and welcoming. He extended a hand, his expression professional but tinged with respect. "It's an honor to meet you in person." "Likewise," Kiana replied, shaking his hand firmly. Her voice carried a quiet confidence, each word deliberate. Michael gestured toward the group behind him. "Shall we?" Kiana nodded, her gaze flickering briefly to the crew members who had mistreated her. They were watching the interaction with visible confusion, their brows furrowed as they exchanged whispered comments. Bryce, in particular, looked uneasy, his gaze darting nervously between Kiana and Michael. The group moved to a quieter corner of the terminal, away from the bustling crowds. Kiana stood at the center, her posture upright, her hands clasped lightly in front of her. The executives flanked her, their polished appearances contrasting sharply with the rumpled uniforms of the crew members. Michael cleared his throat, his tone turning formal. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to introduce Miss Kiana James, the newest majority owner of this airline." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Maddie's mouth fell open, her eyes widening in disbelief. Bryce took a half-step back, his face paling as if he'd been struck. The older crew member blinked rapidly, his hands fidgeting at his sides. What?" Maddie stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. She glanced at Bryce as if searching for confirmation that this was some kind of elaborate joke. Bryce opened his mouth, but no words came out. He looked like he wanted to disappear. Kiana let the moment stretch, her gaze sweeping over the group with measured intensity. Finally, she spoke, her voice calm but firm. "I understand there's been some confusion today about who I am and what I represent. Allow me to clarify." She stepped forward, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. "This morning I was treated with disrespect by members of your team. My luggage was mishandled, my first-class ticket was questioned, and at every turn I was met with an air of disdain that I could neither ignore nor excuse." The crew members stood frozen, their eyes fixed on Kiana, as though the weight of her words had physically pinned them in place. "I've experienced these microaggressions before," Kiana continued, her tone steady but edged with steel. "But what sets this incident apart is that today you're not dealing with just another passenger. You're dealing with the person who now owns a controlling stake in this airline." Her words cut through the air like a blade. Maddie visibly flinched, her hands trembling as she clasped them in front of her. Bryce shifted uncomfortably, his jaw tightening. Michael stepped in, his voice calm but firm. "Miss James has brought this matter to our attention, and we will be conducting a thorough review of today's events. Until that review is complete, you are all suspended from duty, effective immediately." The announcement hit like a thunderstorm. Maddie's face crumpled, tears welling in her eyes. Bryce opened his mouth to protest, but one look from Michael silenced him. Kiana watched them, her expression unreadable. She felt no triumph, only a quiet satisfaction that justice was being served. As the crew members were escorted away, Kiana turned to Michael. "Thank you for your support in addressing this." Michael nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It's the least we can do. This company has a long way to go in ensuring that every passenger and every employee is treated with respect and dignity." Kiana nodded, her gaze drifting back to the terminal's bustling crowds. She thought of the countless others who had endured similar indignities, who hadn't had the power or platform to fight back. This moment wasn't just for her, it was for them too. As she walked toward the exit, her phone buzzed again. This time, the message was from her assistant. "Press conference confirmed for tomorrow. Let's make it count." Kiana smiled faintly, her steps steady and unhurried as she disappeared into the crowd. Justice wasn't just about consequences. It was about creating a world where such moments didn't need to happen at all. And for that, her fight was far from over. The glass doors of the private conference room in the terminal closed with a soft hiss, sealing Kiana and Michael inside. Outside, the baggage claim area buzzed with activity, but here the atmosphere was tense, almost reverent. The executive team stood in a half circle, their polished shoes planted firmly on the pristine floor. They were a picture of composure, yet Kiana could sense the undercurrent of discomfort rippling through the room. Kiana adjusted the cuffs of her blazer, her movements slow and deliberate. She stood at the center of the room, commanding attention without raising her voice or gesturing dramatically. Her presence alone was enough. Michael Hayes, standing slightly to her right, cleared his throat. "Miss James," he began, his voice measured. "Before we proceed, I'd like to extend my sincerest apologies on behalf of the airline. What you experienced today is unacceptable, and I assure you we're taking immediate steps to address it." Kiana acknowledged his words with a slight nod but didn't immediately respond. She allowed the silence to stretch, the weight of the moment settling over everyone in the room. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm but carried an edge that demanded attention. "Apologies are a start, Mr. Hayes," she said, her gaze steady. "But apologies alone won't fix systemic issues. What happened today isn't an isolated incident. It's a symptom of a culture that tolerates bias and disrespect, a culture that must change." Michael nodded, his expression grave. "You're absolutely right." Kiana's eyes swept over the room, landing briefly on each member of the executive team. Some avoided her gaze, their discomfort evident. Others met her eyes with varying degrees of unease, as though they were being called to account for sins they hadn't directly committed, but knew they were complicit in. The door opened and Maddie, Bryce, and the older crew member were led in by a senior HR representative. They looked markedly different from earlier, subdued, their postures stiff, their expressions a mixture of shame and fear. Maddie's eyes were red-rimmed, her hands clasped tightly in front of her as though to steady herself. Bryce avoided looking at anyone, his jaw clenched. The older crew member, whose name badge read Carl, stared at the floor, his face pale. Kiana turned to face them, her expression neutral but her eyes piercing. She let the silence hang for a moment before she spoke. "Do you know why you're here?" she asked, her tone steady. Maddie glanced nervously at Bryce, then back at Kiana. "Because of what happened earlier," she mumbled, her voice barely audible. "That's correct," Kiana said. She took a step closer, her heels clicking against the floor. "But let's be specific. What happened earlier?" Maddie hesitated, her mouth opening and closing as though searching for the right words. Bryce shifted uncomfortably, and Carl finally spoke, his voice gruff but low. "We didn't treat you the way we should have," he admitted, still not looking up. Kiana raised an eyebrow. "And how should you have treated me?" There was another long pause. Maddie finally spoke, her voice trembling. "With respect, like any other passenger." Kiana nodded slowly. "Exactly, like any other passenger. But instead, you chose to assume the worst about me. You questioned the validity of my first-class ticket. You mishandled my luggage. You made comments and gestures that conveyed your disdain. And why? Because I didn't fit your expectations of who belongs in first class?" Bryce opened his mouth as if to protest, but Kiana cut him off with a raised hand. "Don't," she said sharply. "Don't try to explain or excuse it. Not now. This isn't about your intentions. It's about the impact of your actions." Her words landed heavily, and the three crew members seemed to shrink under her gaze. Kiana turned to Michael. "Mr. Hayes, I trust you'll handle the appropriate disciplinary measures for these individuals, but this goes beyond them. This is about creating a culture where this kind of behavior isn't tolerated, where it isn't even a possibility." Michael nodded, his expression somber. "We've already initiated a comprehensive review of our policies and training programs. This incident has highlighted areas where we've clearly fallen short, and we'll be implementing mandatory diversity and inclusion training for all staff." Kiana's gaze softened slightly, though her resolve remained firm. "Good. That's a step in the right direction. But training alone won't change a culture. It has to start from the top, with leadership setting the standard and holding everyone accountable." Michael looked at her, his respect evident. "You have my word, Miss James. We'll make this right." Kiana turned back to the crew members. "I want you to understand something," she said, her tone quieter now but no less powerful. "This isn't just about me. It's about every passenger who has ever been made to feel small, disrespected, or unworthy. Your actions today weren't just unprofessional. They were harmful. And that harm has consequences." Maddie's eyes filled with tears and she nodded, her lips pressed tightly together. Bryce looked away, his face taut with regret. Carl let out a heavy sigh, his shoulders slumping as if the weight of Kiana's words had finally broken through his defenses. Kiana let the silence linger one last time before stepping back. "You're dismissed," she said, her voice firm. The HR representative led the crew members out, their footsteps echoing in the quiet room. As the door closed behind them, Kiana turned to Michael and the executive team. "This is only the beginning," she said. "We have the opportunity to set a new standard in this industry. Let's make sure we don't waste it." Michael extended his hand again, his expression resolute. "We won't," he promised. Kiana shook his hand firmly, her gaze steady. She had fought for this moment, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been underestimated, disrespected, or dismissed. And now, she would ensure it wasn't in vain. As she left the conference room, her heels clicking softly against the floor, she felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. Justice wasn't just about consequences, it was about transformation. And today, she had taken the first step toward creating lasting change. The press conference room was a sharp contrast to the quiet tension of the private meeting earlier. Rows of journalists and cameras lined the space, their lenses gleaming under the overhead lights. The buzz of whispered conversations filled the air, blending with the occasional shuffle of papers and the hum of recording equipment. At the front of the room, a podium stood waiting, flanked by banners bearing the airline's sleek logo. Kiana stood behind a curtain just off stage, her reflection faint in the polished surface of a nearby glass panel. She adjusted the hem of her blazer, her fingers brushing over the fabric as if to anchor herself. The weight of the moment wasn't lost on her. This wasn't just about addressing the events of the day. It was about setting a precedent, sending a message that would ripple far beyond the confines of the airline. "Miss James," Michael Hayes said quietly, stepping up beside her. His tone was respectful, almost deferential. "We're ready when you are." Kiana turned to him, her expression calm but resolute. "Let's do this." As she stepped onto the stage, the room quieted. The scattered whispers and murmurs faded into a still silence, all eyes turning toward her. Kiana moved with deliberate grace, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. She reached the podium and paused, her hands resting lightly on its edges. For a moment, she let her gaze sweep over the room, taking in the sea of faces, some curious, some skeptical, all waiting. "Good afternoon," she began, her voice steady but rich with conviction. "Thank you all for being here today." Her opening words were simple, but the weight of her presence filled the room. She took a breath, her next words carefully measured. "Today, I stand before you not just as the new majority owner of this airline, but as someone who has experienced firsthand the challenges and indignities that too many people face when they travel. Challenges that stem not from policies or procedures, but from assumptions rooted in bias and prejudice." There was a slight shift in the audience, a ripple of unease. Kiana held their attention, her voice unwavering. "This morning, as I prepared to board a flight, I was subjected to behavior that was dismissive, condescending, and deeply unprofessional. My ticket was questioned. My luggage was mishandled. I was treated not as a valued customer but as an inconvenience." The room was silent, the weight of her words pressing down on everyone present. Kiana let the pause stretch for a moment before continuing. "This experience was not unique. It was not isolated, and that is precisely why it cannot be ignored." Michael Hayes, standing off to the side, nodded subtly, his face solemn. Kiana glanced at him briefly before turning her attention back to the audience. "As the new owner, I have a responsibility, not just to this airline but to every passenger who entrusts us with their time, their safety, and their dignity. That responsibility includes ensuring that our staff uphold the highest standards of respect and professionalism, regardless of a passenger's appearance, background, or perceived status. She paused, her gaze sweeping over the room once more. The journalists leaned forward in their seats, their pens poised, their cameras trained on her every move. To that end, Kiana continued, we will be implementing a comprehensive review of our policies and procedures, with a focus on fostering a culture of inclusivity and accountability. This includes mandatory diversity and inclusion training for all employees, from the ground crew to the executive board. A murmur rippled through the room, approval from some, skepticism from others. Kiana pressed on. But training alone is not enough, she said firmly. True change requires accountability, effective immediately. We are establishing a zero-tolerance policy for discriminatory behavior. Any employee found to have acted in a manner that undermines our commitment to inclusivity will face disciplinary action, up to and including termination. At this, the murmur grew louder, the weight of her words sinking in. Kiana allowed it, knowing the gravity of her announcement would take a moment to settle. She stood tall, her presence commanding, as the room quieted once more. This is not just about addressing what happened to me, Kiana said, her voice softening but losing none of its power. It's about creating an environment where every passenger feels respected and valued, where no one has to endure what I endured today. Her gaze softened slightly as she continued. Travel is more than just moving from one place to another. It's about connection, exploration, and opportunity. And those experiences should not be marred by prejudice or bias. Together, we can build an airline that reflects the best of who we are, not just as a company, but as a society. The room erupted into applause, the sound swelling and reverberating against the walls. Kiana stood at the podium, her expression steady, though a faint smile touched her lips. She stepped back slightly as Michael Hayes joined her at the podium. "Thank you, Miss James," he said, his voice resonant. "Your leadership and vision are exactly what this airline needs as we move forward." Kiana inclined her head slightly, acknowledging his words. She turned once more to the audience, her gaze meeting the cameras and the faces behind them. "This is just the beginning," she said simply, "but it's a beginning we can all be proud of." With that, she stepped back, allowing Michael to address the crowd as she retreated to the wings of the stage. The applause followed her, a wave of sound that seemed to echo the shift she had set into motion. As Kiana exited the room, her assistant met her just outside, holding a tablet with a stream of incoming messages. "The feedback is already coming in," they said, their tone a mix of excitement and awe. "People are calling it groundbreaking." Kiana smiled faintly but didn't break her stride. "Good," she said, her voice calm but resolute. "Let's make sure it stays that way." The terminal stretched out before her, bustling with life. Passengers hurried to their gates, announcements echoed over the intercom, and luggage rolled across the tiled floor. But amidst the chaos, Kiana walked with a quiet certainty. She had taken the first step in turning the tide, and she wasn't stopping now. Kiana stepped out of the airline's towering headquarters, the glass doors gliding shut behind her with a soft hiss. The city was alive, bathed in the golden hues of late afternoon. Cars honked, street vendors called out their wares, and pedestrians hurried by, their faces glowing in the light of the setting sun. Yet, amidst the chaos, Kiana felt an unusual sense of calm, as if the world had momentarily aligned itself with her resolve. She paused on the steps of the building, letting the gravity of the past 2 days settle. The fight wasn't over. She knew that. The work she had set in motion would take months, maybe years, to fully materialize. But for now, she had taken a system that had dismissed her, underestimated her, and used it as the foundation for something greater. She had turned the weight of its prejudice into a platform for change. Her phone buzzed in her hand, drawing her attention. It was a message from her assistant. "Your driver's ready. They've parked around the corner." Kiana typed a quick acknowledgement and began walking, her heels clicking softly against the pavement. She blended into the crowd, just another figure moving through the pulse of the city. But in her chest, she carried the quiet fire of a victory hard won. As she turned the corner, the sleek black car idled at the curb, the driver stepping out to open the door for her. Kiana offered a polite nod before sliding into the back seat. The interior was cool and quiet, a welcome reprieve from the noise of the streets. She leaned back against the leather seat, her gaze drifting to the skyline beyond the window. The buildings towered high, their glass facades catching the fading light, but Kiana saw beyond them. She saw the possibilities, the lives that could be changed, the barriers that could be dismantled. She thought of the crew members from the flight, their faces etched with a mixture of shame and realization. Perhaps they too would change. Perhaps they wouldn't. But the systems that had enabled their behavior, those would change. That was a promise she had made, not just to herself, but to every person who had ever been made to feel small. The car rolled to a smooth stop in front of her hotel. Kiana stepped out, pausing for a moment to take in the scene. The grand entrance gleamed under the soft glow of lanterns, and the doorman greeted her with a respectful nod. She walked inside, the cool air of the lobby washing over her as she made her way to the elevator. Once inside her suite, she removed her blazer and draped it carefully over the back of a chair. The city stretched out before her through the floor-to-ceiling windows, alive with a million stories unfolding in its streets. She stood there for a moment, her reflection merging with the lights beyond, and allowed herself to feel the weight of what she had accomplished. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a message from Michael Hayes. "Your vision inspires us. Let's keep flying higher." Kiana smiled faintly, her thumb hovering over the keyboard before she typed a reply. "We will. Together." She set the phone down and walked to the small bar in the corner of the room. Pouring herself a glass of water, she raised it slightly, as if to toast the quiet triumph of the moment. "To new beginnings," she whispered to herself. As the evening deepened and the city outside began to shimmer under a canopy of stars, Kiana sat by the window, her thoughts steady and clear. The world wasn't perfect, not yet, but today she had taken one step closer to making it better, and tomorrow she would take another. With a quiet breath, she closed her eyes, letting the stillness of the moment wash over her. The storm that had begun with a single careless act had transformed into a movement, one that would ripple outward and touch lives far beyond her own. Justice was in motion, and it was unstoppable. For Bryce, the consequences of his actions were just beginning to unfold. A week after being suspended, he attended a job interview with a regional airline, hoping to move on quickly. Dressed in his best suit, he rehearsed answers to questions he feared might come up. But as soon as the interviewer leaned forward and asked, "Can you explain why you left your previous position?" Bryce's confidence crumbled. His polished words faltered, and the interviewer's skeptical expression only deepened. Bryce left the interview with a sinking feeling in his chest, knowing that his reputation had preceded him, and not in a good way. The realization hit him hard. The casual disrespect he'd shown to a passenger had not only cost him his current job, but might also jeopardize his future in the industry. The fight was over. Kiana was ready to rest, and tomorrow she would fly again. And just like that, the tables had turned. Justice wasn't just served, it made a statement. Kiana walked away with her dignity intact and a powerful lesson delivered. Let this story remind us that respect is never optional, and assumptions can lead to shocking consequences. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more like it, make sure to subscribe to our channel, hit the like button, and turn on notifications. You don't want to miss what's coming next.